Good evening, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House Museum. And tonight we are welcoming back Colm Tóibín to discuss his new book of essays, A Guest at the Feast, with Connecticut's very own Susan Campbell. Before we begin, I want to thank Colm for graciously accepting our invitation and Susan for agreeing to moderate for us once more. I think this is maybe your 7th time?
I want to get good at it.
I also want to thank our sponsors who make our programs possible. Those are Connecticut Humanities, the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, Ensworth Charitable Foundation, Bank of America, the Greater Hartford Arts Council's United Arts Campaign, the Hartford, the Mark Twain Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Travelers. Now on to introductions. Our moderator, Susan Campbell, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a widely read newspaper columnist, and the author of 3 books. She has worked across the media landscape as an award-winning print journalist, a regular commentator on WNPR, and a guest on CBS's Sunday Morning, the BBC, WTNH-TV, and the local news show Face the State. She was also part of the Connecticut Health Investigative Team, an award-winning health and safety website. She currently writes a weekly Sunday column for Hearst newspapers in Connecticut. Our author, Colm Tóibín, is the author of 10 novels, including The Magician, winner of the Rathbones Folio Prize, The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, The Testament of Mary and Nora Webster, as well as 2 story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University and has been named as the laureate for Irish fiction for 2022 to 2024 by the Arts Council of Ireland. 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize, Toibin lives in Dublin and New York. So that's all from me, and I will turn this over to Colm and Susan. Please sit back and enjoy.
We should get, can you hear me okay? No? How about now? How about now? Okay. We should get one housekeeping thing out of the way. Colm tells me that he and I are allowed to sleep in the Mark Twain House tonight, and he's already picked out his bedroom.
And my bathroom.
I called the billiard room. I am so honored to be on stage with you, but I have to ask, why do you have money in your book?
Oh, because in case I had to read something, in case you sprung on me, would you read something? I have it marked where I would, just in case.
Would you like to read something?
Well, I could.
Please.
You want me to start with that?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I promise you, it works. I'm in my mother's bedroom. It is September the 9th, 2000, the morning after she has died. This room is as she had left it when she was suddenly taken to hospital. She was 79. I am trying to recapture her. I am trying to imagine what these last years of her life have been like. Some of the furniture is new to me. Some pieces were not there when I was growing up, but the wardrobe in the corner near the window is as it always has been, and it was on the top of that wardrobe, as in another essay, that I found 3 books when I was nosing around in my parents' room. I found John Updike's Couples, John McGahern's The Dark, and Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls, all 3 of which were banned by the Irish Censorship Board at that time. And they were partly, I think, hidden from my father by my mother, but there were books that were passed around from woman's house to woman's house, sort of liberal women in the town who wanted to know what was really going on. My mother left school at 14. For her last 2 years there, she had a teacher, a nun, Sister Catherine, who had a profound effect on her. She loved the poetry she learned from Sister Catherine in those 2 years, loved reciting as she moved about the house, Shelley, Matthew Arnold, Tennyson, Browning, the early Yeats. And when she was in her 20s, a touring theatre came to the town regularly and did Shakespeare. And those performances of Hamlet and King Lear, especially Othello, meant the world to her. She learned long speeches from Shakespeare and recited these to herself in the kitchen. My mother's hunger for books and her lack of formal education gave her a sort of freedom that is mostly lost now in a developed world. Soon after my father died in 1967, the Irish censorship laws were relaxed and paperback books, even ones about sex, became freely available. And in the 30 years that followed, my mother devoured books without much idea that there was a canon, and with a taste that was confident and unpredictable. For example, none of Joyce interested her. The early work was too dreary, she thought, and the later work too obscure. She paid no attention to the later Yeats. But when she discovered Wallace Stevens, she got years of pleasure from him. She loved the luxury of his language, his uplifted tone, and she didn't mind at all when she failed to understand a line. And this led her to Eliot, but to the wasteland rather than the four quartets, which she found too abstract. She learned Death by Water as part of the wasteland by heart, and she encouraged anyone around her to learn it too, which means that I can still go Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. O Gentile or Jew, will you turn the wheel and look to windward? Consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. She lived in a town of 6,000 people. She had no one to talk to about poetry. No one she knew was reading the way she was. So she kept her garden, she played bridge and Scrabble, and she went on outings with her friends. She did, as James Merrill said about Elizabeth Bishop, a lifelong impersonation of an ordinary woman. But in the meantime, she was discovering Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath and Philip Larkin and R.S. Thomas from anthologies that she bought when she went to Dublin, and then from volumes of their work. Sometime in the 1970s, my mother began to pay attention to fiction. She hated anything she deemed slow-moving. Dickens, George Eliot, Jane Austen were all slow-moving, not to speak of the Brontes. She liked novels to be smart, she said. It was impossible to give her a novel or recommend something to her because it was hard to tell what in her book was smart and what was slow-moving. I felt, in fact, that she thought that my novels were slow-moving rather than smart, and she just didn't really want to tell me. But she found a way of, a sort of coded way of letting me know, because she discovered Saul Bellow. And Saul Bellow was for her the essence of smart. She, a middle-aged Irish Catholic widow in a provincial town, loved the raunchy bits of Bellow. The sex drive of his heroes delighted her. She loved Bellow's women to their fleshiness and sensuality. And then she would read the overblown prose of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and she would love that also. There was no talking to her. Saint-Exupéry led her to Proust. She confined herself to Swan's Way, which she read over and over. Was it not slow-moving? I asked. Oh, it is, she said, but I don't care. Slowly, then, she built up her own canon. Simone de Beauvoir, especially the non-fiction, was in. Sartre was out. She would often say that she'd give anything to be Simone de Beauvoir, to live in Paris and have your boyfriend in some other building and have no children and just get on with reading and writing and smoking and going to bars and so on. Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann was in. The rest of Thomas Mann was out. Almost all contemporary Irish fiction was out. Almost all contemporary Irish poetry was in. The Americans, she would say, they were the smartest, but she could not believe that I loved Henry James, yet she talked very little about what she didn't like. She would never use a word like out about a book. She remembered a time when books were rare and precious objects, even dangerous objects. She would shake her head and smile and say nothing, and then say that she would be happy with just Shakespeare and a few modern poems. I'm in my mother's bedroom on the morning after she's died. On the locker beside her bed is a list of numbers for use in an emergency, headed by the number of the doctor, the hospital, the ambulance service. Her prayer book is here, and Catholic pamphlets to help her towards a happy death. She's burnt all her diaries. She burnt all her diaries, but tore out 5 or 6 pages describing a holiday in Spain and the light and the freedom and the happiness. She's left these pages lying there. She's left 2 notebooks, one from the 1940s with poems transcribed and one from recent years with poems cut out from the Irish Times. And scattered around on top of this locker, or the other locker, or on the floor, are the books she was reading in the time before she died. Doris Lessing's Love Again has been left half finished. Funny she never mentioned Lessing. And books by the Irish poet Sean Donne, who had died a few years earlier, whose poems are elegant and elegiac. And a paperback volume of Thomas Hardy's selected poems that looks recently bought, with a bookmark on his poems from 1912, but the loss of his wife, which are almost unbearably sad. Now, knowing that she must have read them in her last weeks, it makes me wonder how brave she must have been, or maybe not. Maybe the poems shocked her as much as they shock me now. Everything she read, when she had left the care of Sister Catherine, she discovered for herself. Her private life, her secret self for the last 30 years of her life, and perhaps for the years before, came from books with a printed word. She knew nothing about the theories and movements that came and went in her lifetime. She was what most writers long for, what most of us still write for, the ordinary reader. Curious and intelligent and demanding, ready to be moved and changed, and believing still that the written word has all the power to make the deepest imprint on the private self.
Did your mother write poetry?
She did. She published poetry before she married, and there was one poem of hers that was in the local paper, and then a national paper, the Irish Press in Dublin, discovered the poem and printed it, saying there's marvellous poetry being written in rural Ireland. Look at this one, for example. And she cut that out and had it pasted it into the back of a book, which I still have. And then after a certain point, then she didn't.
She stopped writing.
She stopped, yeah.
But she continued reading.
That's correct.
Was there ever a time when you didn't read and write?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I came late to both. I mean, I was about 8 or 9 before my sister would read for me, so I didn't see any need for it. The only thing she did was, if anyone has ever experienced that, the other person, if it's a comic book, she'll go ahead of you. I say, no, like she like you're still looking at the pictures and and she's turning the page already, But no, ever since then I've been busy reading and writing. Yeah.
And the depth and breadth of your essays in particular, it makes me wonder, A, is Irish education so much better than American education? And how much more do I need to read to catch up?
Oh, I don't think the education matters at all, really, in the sense that if you're interested in reading, you tend to do it on your own. A teacher can be very, very helpful sometimes, but it's often just one. Everyone talks about one teacher. The rest, you can be very bored in school, but there was one teacher, for me, who was incredibly encouraging and helpful and decent, and I think that makes a difference. But I was reading anyway.
What books were in your home, other than the dirty books?
My father wrote history articles, and he was a sort of local historian, and therefore there were just loads of history books, boring history books that he had, and all these history notes, and he was always busy with those things. And then on the other side would be my mother's poetry books that were kept separate from his books, near the twain would meet, almost,
So many of the people in your books, and I want to talk about this essay book, but so many of the people in your books are based on. Do people recognize themselves, or do you wait till they're dead?
You mean, do you wait till they're dead? My mother got upset. I mean, the beginning really was where I published a short story, and I thought it was fine. I saw no problem, but she said, everyone will recognize me. And I said, but how? She said, well, the woman has a big load of children, and instead of setting the places for each, at meals, she would just put all the knives and forks in the middle of the table and just grabbed, and she said, I'm the only person that does that, and people will know it's me. So you had to be sort of careful from then on. But I had an aunt and uncle who just decided never to mention I'd written a book at all, which I think is a marvelous idea. They just pretended there were no books. And even though I have a long account in one book of visiting my aunt and her house, since she didn't mention it, I saw no reason not to worry. I saw no reason to worry about it. But luckily there were novels like The Master about Henry James, where everyone was dead.
He's not going to complain.
No. But writing about life in a small town has its moments of worry, Yeah. I mean, for example, I have a novel called Nora Webster, which is really a description of my mother's life after my father died. And she did go back to the work she'd had before. And she did work in the same room as the boss's daughter. And they got on incredibly well, the two of them. And she would come home she only worked in the mornings. She'd come home full of all the stories the boss's daughter had told her about dances and places she'd gone to the weekend and who she'd met. And the problem with me is that I didn't ever forget any of that. So when it came to writing the novel, I had it to hand, the different things that had happened. I often worry that I might meet the boss's daughter. I mean, we're all old now. She said to me, you couldn't have, how did you know that? I said, well, my mother told me. You told her,
Which makes it okay. In a book of essays like this, how do you even begin to decide which ones to include?
Well, it's almost the opposite. You realize that some things you've written are really boring, and you make sure to leave them out. In other words, it starts like that, saying, that's not going in, that's not going in. But there was a piece I wrote for The New Yorker about the Catholic Church in Ireland and the decline of the church and how that began. And I always thought that should be in a book, that piece. And then when I went to read it for this book, it was too detailed. It belonged to its moment. It had too much of just description of tiny political things that were happening. And it didn't work. After all these years, it just didn't. I thought, no one is going to care. And luckily I could judge. So I thought I think the general idea, if you're writing novels, and as a journalist you know this, the first question you need to ask yourself, is this interesting? Because if it isn't interesting, don't write it. And if you've written it and it isn't interesting, scrap it. So that, and the only person who can really judge that is you. Someone else can tell you, but you mightn't believe them. But reading over your own work after a long period of time, you think, who wrote that? And it's not getting into the book.
Okay, so was it an easy choice? I have to say, to start an essay, it all started with my balls. I'm going to read the whole thing and probably go back.
I was walking along the street, and I promised. Look, one thing I hate more than anything else are cancer survivor memoirs. You just think, my battle against cancer, suggesting that people who didn't survive didn't battle hard enough, or just going on smugly about, I'm all right now, but, and I want to thank the doctors and the hospital, the nurses, and I hate those books. And I promised I wouldn't write one. When I lay there with, chemoed up to my neck, I thought, one thing I'm not doing is ever describing this. This is mine, it's pain, it's anguish, it's misery, but I'm not writing it. And then one day I was walking along the street, and because I had testicular cancer, and a sentence came into my head. I really wasn't inviting this sentence into my head. And the sentence is there. It all started with my balls. And once I thought of that, I went home and I wrote it down. And then I started to get more sentences. And then I found I'm writing the very thing that I promised I wouldn't write. And then I thought, well, I'm not going to publish it. I just leave it in a drawer, which no writer ever does. This no one ever does. You can dream on, And so I sent it to this magazine in London saying, I promised, I sent a note saying, I'm not sure this is of any interest to anyone. And they used the piece, and then, it became something that people were reading. And so there was a big argument over whether to put it first in the book or the last, but I just thought, let's just start. Let's get this part over with,
It is not like a cancer memoir in any way, and I don't even have those parts and felt it the way you described it. It was painful. Oh, my God. So there's a quote from you, and I believe it was in a New Yorker profile. I'm sorry I didn't write it down. I have absolute curiosity and total commitment. Can you be a writer without that?
I don't think so. In other words, even the cancer thing, the chemo nurses. Anyone who's even knows anything about chemo or cancer, the nurses are a law unto themselves. They're not like us. They have to be so careful. Because if they make a medical mistake, it's the end of you if they put the wrong juice into you. But even more, you're always watching them for signs of reassurance or for news, or has a result come back yet? And their job is not to tell you, because it's the doctor's job to tell you. But also, reassurance, you've got to be very careful with cancer, because you can't really give people a full diagnosis, but also in their strength of character. You just love when they come into the room because it always has something interesting to say. And my ones worked. They worked. Let me think. They worked a 7-day week, 12 hours a day, and then they got a week off. Now that means the younger ones were permanently on holidays for that week. So they would have gone to Ibiza and gone discoing. So they come back in absolutely filled with accounts of what Ibiza had been like that week. And I'd be lying in bed delighted to hear all about it. So, in other words, that sort of basic interest in how the hospital worked and the doctor. And so, the hospital as a parish, the hospital as a sort of locus for real interest. And I suppose the commitment is the commitment to, if you don't get that first sentence, don't write the piece, don't force it. If unless that cancer piece comes naturally, don't sit down one day to see if you could write it, because things don't work like that.
They don't, but how do you, so that sentence came to you. The other essays, do they start with a sentence, or you read an article and think, I want to explore that, or?
Often something is commissioned, so you just have to do it. But you have to sort of, but say with that piece I read at the beginning, I wrote some of those pieces I started writing them late at night, for no reason, not knowing where they would go, what I would do with them, just things I wanted to write down. And then I found a place for them, for a whole lot of sort of short memoir pieces of that length, just describing various things about. And I discovered something that in Ireland, there's so many images. I wonder if it's true here of people being really angry with their parents, and that is a literary method. You write down my father was like, what a creep, and my mother, how cold or cruel. I thought, I don't feel like that. I don't have a drama surrounding, feeling bitter or bad. I just don't feel it. And trying to write that down, like what it was like then to be in a house where you were generally left alone and generally left in peace, and you don't have any bad feelings. It's not, it becomes something that you think, I need to write that down because I don't have many other images of it. It's not something that people write much. That my child, people can be blissfully happy, and that's of no interest. But I'm talking about the middle thing, which is perhaps the most common thing.
That makes me wonder, I can't remember where I read this, I'm sure I stole it from somewhere, that great writing comes from great trauma. It also comes from the middle things?
No, I'm not sure about that, because I was at some festival. I was minding my own business. I was sat down beside some writer, and she turned to me and said, "So what do they do to you?" And then I understood. What happened to me was that my father died when I was 12, and he had a huge brain operation when I was 8. So, in writing about my father, there, I'm writing about the things I remember that were okay, but all of that was taken away. And my mother had to go back to work. One day we had a car, one day we didn't have a car. And you could call that trauma. It felt like, it didn't, of course, it was no word. Trauma was not, right. Trauma didn't happen then. You learned afterwards. I'm taking a huge interest in this Prince Harry. I know I'm Irish and I know it's wrong, but I'm taking a huge interest in this Prince Harry thing, because he was 12. And it looked as though he didn't have a language for what he was going through in those few years afterwards that he then got from an analyst. So he learned to describe what it was he felt, and that became a huge liberation for him. In the same way that even saying the word trauma, like a 12-year-old is not meant to feel anything much. Certainly in 1967, there was an idea that children get over things. Mm-hmm. Later, people realize it's the opposite. Children bottle things up, and it's horrifying.
But you have been chronicling, as a journalist, as an essayist, as a novelist, an incredible history of Ireland, recent history of Ireland. There's been so much happened since you first put pen to paper that it's such a great time to be alive in Ireland. I don't know if I should say it that way.
The first book I wrote was where I walked along the border between Ireland North and South. I just set off at the beginning of the summer with a rucksack, and I walked along without any. I decided to have no prejudices, but then I realized I didn't actually have any prejudices. That if I met someone Protestant, I was delighted to see them, because I would, often you didn't meet Protestants in the South. And I met Protestants who'd been through a great deal because, you know, there had been a great deal of murder, especially in the border area, and people felt besieged. And so I walked along, I felt with a reasonably open mind. Even if I met a British soldier, I was desperate, you know, what map was he using, or just to say something to him. So that was my first book, which was really an attempt to describe how strange that border country was, how hard it is to map, even to get a proper map of it, but also how it isn't a single border. In other words, it changes. I suppose the atmosphere changes every 10 miles. So it isn't a single political problem. It became about 20 political problems. You know, some areas were rich, some were poor, some had Catholic majorities, other Protestant majorities. It just depended on where you were. So as a journalist, you had to be really careful to make no generalizations.
You write beautifully about the Catholic faith, and there is an essay, Among the Flutterers, included in this book, where you talked about it would have been, I'm going to say this wrong, please correct me, it was not an easy choice, but a logical choice. If you were homosexual, if you were queer in Ireland and a man, to become a priest. And you said you may have thought about it, but you didn't think you would have made a convincing priest?
Made a better bishop, I think. I think people began to notice in the 1980s, 1990s, that a lot of Catholic priests seemed to be homosexual, and they wondered, how did this happen? I was trying to explain this, that if you're gay, as I am, if you're gay in a repressed society, you cannot see any image of yourself in any mirror. There's nothing about you on TV, or at least there wasn't then, and you're trying to think, is there any way I could live? And you think, well, if I became a priest, no one would ever ask me, well, where's your girlfriend? Or you're not thinking of getting married soon? You know, is there something wrong with you? Like, they wouldn't ask a priest that. But I think more important that you would be wanted and not despised. Some people would want you for baptism, for marriages, for death, that you would be someone honored and looked up to in the society. And so that there were very good reasons why this happened. That was something I was just trying to explain.
But you would prefer being a bishop?
I really enjoy the gossip in the church. You know, I love being around people who talk about Rome and somebody could be a cardinal next year and that cardinal. You know, it's really great gossip. The Catholic Church is about hierarchy. Oh yes.
Oh. There is
I mean, a novel is just a form of gossip. It's just, what else is a novel? It's telling people things they didn't know before that they might be interested in. Isn't that what, like, is that?
Do you have a preference? Would you, if you were in your writing heaven, would you be writing essays? Would you be writing a novel? Does it depend on the day?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. I always have a novel on the go. You know, I'm never without a novel, but then I interrupt them to write anything else that anyone asks me to do that seems interesting. I mean, a novel's going to take you 3 years no matter what you do, but you can't work every day because there are times when you need to stop, slow down, and wait for the next part to become fully clear to you before you write it.
What does that look like? The part becomes fully clear to you.
That there's a detail you still need, that just tiny things. I'm in a situation at the moment where I have finished a novel, but there's a big moment where they go, the man and the woman, and they spend a night together, which they've never done before, in a hotel. And you know, I thought I was great because in George Eliot's Middlemarch, the honeymoon is not described. They get married and then they're in Rome. In Portrait of a Lady, the honeymoon is not described. They are going to marry, and then you see them 2 or 3 years later. So I thought, well, if George Eliot can do it, Henry James can do it. And so then I realized I couldn't do it, that it didn't work. That, you know, leaving a gap of such an important night for both of them. Like, you don't even get any of it. And I thought, like, you need, I just don't want to write about sex. I'm fed up writing about sex, so I don't want to write about sex. But I want to write, I need to fill that in. And at the moment, I'm in that stage where I'm constantly working out. There was an old restaurant in Dublin, and called Nico's, and it was in Dame Street. It's gone now. It was an Italian restaurant. It was really good, and at night it had a piano player, and it was very shadowy. And I wrote a piece about it, saying that that it was the sort of place where you could go with someone who was way out of your league. And because the place was so dark and the atmosphere was so romantic, that you could nearly get away with it, And but it's a place I used to go a lot. So I thought, if I bring them into that restaurant, and then I thought, where will I put them sitting? And he will never have been in an Italian restaurant before. Is that too much of a problem? So I'm working through all the details of where they'll sit, what they'll talk about. And she's been living in America. This was 1976. So she's sort of filled with the whole business of Nixon and Watergate, because she's been really following it, as people did. And she thinks that because he's Irish, he might know, without realizing how much people in Ireland followed all of that, how much people in Ireland follow American politics. And he starts to talk to her about it in a way that's intelligent. And she's really interested in that, because suddenly she finds that she can talk. So I haven't written a word of this. This is now going through. And up to about 2 days ago, he already knew the restaurant. It was one of the strange things about him, that restaurant, he went to Dublin sometimes and he went into an Italian restaurant. 2 days ago, that just faded. That's just too far-fetched, too much explanation, too much going back into his earlier trips to Dublin. He's never been in the restaurant. It's been recommended to him. It's new to him. But 2 days ago, that wasn't the case.
But that's important that it's new to him because of something you're coming up with down the road. I don't
Yeah,
write
but
novels.
it's something I don't want to. If it's not new to him, I have to go back and explain when he went there before, why he went there before. And that's just going to take up too much space earlier. It's just as easy if he comes into it new. But I'm saying that this is what the gap is like, where you have the scene and you keep refining it and changing it and seeing what you can do with it. So that's what I'm talking about.
Makes
And
sense.
in a way, the less you're doing, lying in bed scratching yourself is often just as useful as writing, because you might stop scratching yourself and start thinking seriously about something you'll do with your novel. So the in-between parts are really useful and actually necessary.
You mentioned that in your book how much people in Ireland pay attention to American politics. I can't even say that without laughing. Do they? And how do we look?
Irish people are very prejudiced. Irish people are generally Democrat, and they love the Kennedys and they love the Clintons.
How do we look? Never mind. That's plenty.
They love the Kennedys, love the Clintons, and of course they love Barack Obama
There you go.
and Joe Biden. So yeah, I think we're Democrats.
Okay. We'll keep up. I'm Protestant. We'll keep up. That's right. There is an essay in this book on the Ferns Report, which I was vaguely aware of just from reading about it, that I learned so much from this in such a painful thing. If you want to talk about the Ferns Report, I won't even try to boil it down. But
I went to a boarding school when I was 15. They decided that I should study more, and they sent me to a boarding school called St. Peter's College, which is a diocesan school, meaning that it was controlled by the bishop and it was effectively run by priests. So most of your teachers, the physics teacher was a Catholic priest. And oddly enough, it was a very liberal and open place. I had never had any problems there. It was liberal and open partly because the priest teachers had the summers free, and they came to America in the summer to stand in for American priests. And so this is 1970. So they were coming. I remember a priest handing me a book called The Greening of America. And this was the news they were bringing back from America. It was about the civil rights movement, it was about the environmental movement, and everything was up for discussion, from church-state relations, contraception, abortion, all divorce, all those things. Nobody ever mentioned homosexuality. It just wasn't mentioned. And so what happened then was that in the 2000s, young people who had been young in that school began to go to psychoanalysts, and psychoanalysts said to them, you have to go forward, you have to go to the police, you have to tell your wife, you have to tell everyone, I was abused in that school by a priest. You have to do that. You can't go forward without that. And so very shy fellows from the Irish countryside simply went into a police station and said, I have a complaint to make. And they began to go in some numbers, enough that the government, that at one point, one of them who had suffered a great deal in London, again, liberated by psychoanalysis, went to it, and he actually worked as a journalist, and he worked in television. And he went into the BBC and said, look, I have a story of my own. And they said, well, go and tell it. So he went back to Ireland with the TV crew to say, I was abused in this school. The bishop knew. The complaint was made to the bishop. How come the bishop did nothing about it? The following bishop, the subsequent bishop, and then he went and he doorstepped a bishop. Now, in Ireland, you don't, or you didn't, you doorstep, I mean, on TV. And the bishop looked frightened. And but anyway, the government commissioned a report on the Diocese of Ferns, in the same way as here it might have been some part of Boston, which, became known, what was happening. And the report then described very clearly the architecture of the school I was in. And I mean, some of this would be funny if it wasn't so awful, that one priest who went to jail, but when the school was building dark rooms, because they thought that the boys should learn how to develop photographs, who got put in charge of the dark room? Father Collins did. How do I know how to develop photographs? Because Father Collins showed me how to do this. When they were building a swimming pool, who got put in charge of the swimming pool? Swimming lessons, Father Collins did. And I suppose my point would be that the other priests must have known something of this, and they didn't speak, and they didn't do anything about it, and that all of this was left to fester. Reports, complaints to the bishop doing nothing about it. I mean, sometime one of the bishops must have felt, this is incredible that a priest would do this. It must be some madness on the part of the family of the boy, because it's not credible. But of course, it was true. It was not credible, except it was true. And the report was shocking for me, because I was seeing, it was like being given back parts of those, I was only there for 2 years, parts of those 2 years in a whole new light. Why did Father Collins, why did the bishop put him sleeping in that room up there rather than in the corridor with the rest of the priests? It explained all that. But it explained an extraordinary culture of power, that it was about what happens to authority if there is no one to control authority? Who is above the bishop? And the answer is nobody, not the police. Because there were occasions, and there was a particularly awful one where a priest decided to interfere with little girls who were going up for their first communion. And when the parents complained, the policeman just tore up the complaints. So, in other words, you're talking about power in which there's no one, which the church is accountable to no one. And in that situation, the church did its worst.
It was an incredible essay. In an essay about Ms. Robinson, this is a quote: God represents a real problem for the novelist.
This is an essay about Marilynne Robinson. I don't know if, I think she's a great American writer, and she's done something unusual in that she's explored a sort of strange, sort of Episcopalian, Presbyterian Calvinist in the Midwest, in a time that seems timeless, but it's probably the 1950s going into the 60s. Although there's no real 60s in her work. It's not as though the Beatles get into her work or anything like that. But I'm trying to describe a problem in the novel, which is it's very hard in a novel to have a character pray. That you think of any novel, think of Jane Austen. They don't pray. It isn't as though Elizabeth knelt down that night and asked God to give her £10,000, and the next morning, that's a fairy tale. That's out of a sermon. But that the novel loves losing money, making money, getting money by inheritance. It loves choices. It loves chances. It loves human things. It loves destiny. It loves anything that is secular. But it's very, very hard for the novelist to deal with the divine. It just loves light and on earth, but the light of heaven is not something it's good with. Characters in novels tend to be flawed. They don't tend to be saints, and they're never going to be saints. So reading Marilynne Robinson, then you realize she's trying to deal with it. She's trying to push this material and seeing what she could do with deeply, deeply religious characters who believe merely that this life is a preparation for the one to come. And they live fully in that belief. It's not as though this is often with someone like Flannery O'Connor, you realize her characters are not really Catholics, they're just trying it out. But with Marilyn Robinson, you really believe it. Yeah.
We said we would let the audience ask questions. I have one more. I read in an interview that you had originally thought you would become a civil servant. Are you ever disappointed with the way things worked out?
The whole idea in Ireland in the 60s, that there was extraordinary change where, really, there was a minister for education, and in 1967, he said that there would be full, free secondary, meaning high school education for everyone in the country, that there would be no longer any fees to be paid anywhere. I mean, except in very posh Jesuit schools or something. And this really made a difference to not only the society, but the economy, because it meant a super educated class was would come in the 70s and would emerge. For example, if you wanted, if you were a multinational company, you thought, where can I find a cheap, a cheap country, but that's got a highly motivated and highly educated workforce? Ireland. But in 1969, he went further and introduced free university education for people below a certain level. In other words, if you got it was pretty easy to get, actually, result in your final exams. You got a scholarship to go to university, no fees, plus a stipend to go to university. And this changed. People suddenly realized, I can go to university. And I noticed recently there was a review of that Sally Rooney book. It's the one where they're both in Trinity College. The cleaner's son is in Trinity College, and the woman who has the rich house daughter. And someone said, "This is just not. How could that be?" Well, it could be in Ireland because that's what was organised. And so, the next thing we needed to change was the curriculum. The boring old curriculum needs to be upgraded and needs to be made relevant and needs to be exciting. It doesn't mean you drop Hamlet, but it means that people like me had our lives fired up by Emily Dickinson with the right teacher. But putting Emily Dickinson on the curriculum instead of some boring 19th century male poet. But just I would have been interested in being in the middle of that argument around education and around sort of changing the country through the curriculum. But I had to go and do something else.
How would you like to do questions? Does anyone have a question from the audience? We have a microphone. We have somebody here. If you could wait just a moment, they're streaming and they want everybody to be able to hear.
I was struck by how you started the essay on testicular cancer. It kind of started with a sentence, and it reminded me of Joseph Heller said he wrote his novels. He'd start with a sentence and then go to the second sentence, and he might write for 14 pages, and if it worked out, that was great, and if it didn't, he'd stop and start with a new sentence. Do you do any of your fiction the way you did that?
Yeah, that would be how it would work. But the thing is that only comes once. If you say, "Oh, I need more inspiration to go on," once you have the first sentence, it's work. You need to sit down and do it every day until the piece is finished, because that business of waiting for the right tone is only for the opening, or if you need it, maybe you need it later on for another sort of opening of another chapter. But you could sit back having got that first sentence and think, well, I'll wait till another one comes. No, it has come. From the first sentence should lead you to a second one. And then you should, so you have to work. Yeah. So thank you.
Any other questions?
Question over there?
There's
a question right in the middle. I don't know what you're going to do.
I just started reading this 3 days ago and I found you. Marilyn Robinson, isn't that also the name of one of the Irish presidents? Or am I...
Mary Robinson.
Oh my gosh. So I was like, was she a scholar? Did she want... And then it was the author of Gilead.
Yeah, exactly. Gilead and Home and Lila. Yeah.
Book together. So
Yeah, thank you.
There's
a mic coming towards you, coming this way.
favorite book is Mad, Dangerous to Know, which I've read twice, and my favorite book of yours, I've only read 3 though, is Mad, Bad, Dangerous to Know, The Fathers of Wilde, Yeats, and Joyce. I think you talked about doing some of your research in Union College for that, and if you could just tell me about what took you there to get to know those gentlemen. And I think the life of Oscar Wilde and his mother and his father it's such a beautiful story.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to write about how these fathers had affected their sons, not necessarily influencing directly. For example, Oscar Wilde's father was a doctor, but he was also a philanderer, and he was involved in a great scandal sex case as a doctor, which sort of mirrors his son. But I mean, in the case of W.B. Yeats, which is very close to Henry James's father, he was a great non-finisher of things, old man Yeats. He couldn't finish a self-portrait. He tended to talk rather than... He was meant to be a painter. He could do sketches, whereas his son became a great finisher. The stanzas of Yeats's poems have clanging rhymes at the end. Henry James's father, too, was a great talker. He couldn't finish anything either. But it's interesting to watch the sons beginning to... kill their fathers by finishing their novels. And and of course, Joyce's father was a tremendous drinker and talker, and praiser of himself. Joyce also was a tremendous drinker, but he wrote Ulysses. I mean, he sat down and wrote the book, which his father had not been capable of. But he put his father into the book. His father was very useful material for him. But I was interested in those, just charting those, just the single relationship, father to son.
But you add that Yeats's mother was from Western Donegal, and what her voice brought to his...
Yeah. That Yeats's mother came from Sligo, just south of Donegal, and of course that meant because his father made so little money, the children had to spend a lot of time with their maternal grandparents, which gave them that landscape, gave them that magic, gave them that sense. But it was, of course, it was borrowed, which made it all the more interesting. That it was summer holidays, that it was, so it gave him a sense of the beauty of that landscape and the sense of magic that was in the air there.
Yeah. And lastly, Wilde's father ended up going to that part of Ireland. It was a great document.
Yeah, he became a great antiquarian. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. We'll ask you to talk into the microphone. There's 70 people streaming, watching.
Oh, hi streamers.
Shout out to the streamers. Just so that the microphone can pick up your question.
Yeah, we have one question from the streaming audience. This is from Kathleen Costello-Sullivan, who asks about an autobiographical fragment that you wrote, Guest in the Feast, circa 2011. And is this collection totally new, or how has that fragment changed over the ensuing decade? Looking so forward to reading, she says.
Thanks, Kate. I know her, and I want to send her fraternal greetings. That section has changed for this book to the simple business of reading, that I read it, and if there was a boring paragraph, I cut the boring paragraph out. So it's as simple as that, really. I think it's all the same pieces, but it's shorter. It's shorter because I think as I get older, I get less tolerant of myself and think, why did you write that? No one wants to read that. Does anyone care? No, they don't. So therefore, that's the only difference. It's shorter.
There's some down here.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your conversation and sharing with us. It sounds like you do a lot of writing, and I'm not sure you have time for a lot of reading. You mentioned Marilynne Robinson as somebody who you find a beautiful writer, an important writer. Are there others that you would commend to us?
There are a few Irish writers, such as John McGahern, who I think should be much better known here. That's Gahern, a novel called Amongst Women, for example. I'm having a nice time at the moment because I'm teaching Ulysses at Columbia to a group of immensely enthusiastic undergraduates. And just in case anybody thinks, the young people are going to the dogs in some way, well, it's just not true. This is a difficult book. Requires a lot of concentration, and it also requires some knowledge of the Odyssey. So you have to go and do your homework. And I'm finding the intricacies of the novel, especially in recent years, absolutely fascinating. Just the whole way Joyce's mind worked and the whole way that big book. I suppose the correspondences between that and the Odyssey, and then the sense of felt life in the book. I mean, just the amount of description. Just today we were laughing in the class because there's a description of two shirts hanging on a line. But he doesn't, that's not what he says. He says, two shirts crucified. You know, with the, I don't, like, that is just an extraordinary, it's just a tiny image. But those sort of things, and there's a famous episode 3 in the book, which really is, it's called Proteus, and it's the one that really stops people and thinks this book is not for me. Who is he talking about in that first paragraph? Who is the he? And it's just fine because you can just blissfully sit in the class and say, the he is Aristotle. I'm sorry to tell you, he means Aristotle, because we're in his mind. He doesn't need to spell it out, Aristotle, because he's walking along the beach and he's just thinking he, and he, I'm sorry, is Aristotle. But, so I'm getting a lot of pleasure at the moment from James Joyce, from Ulysses. Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else?
There's a question down here.
Right here.
Just there.
Hi, thank you for coming. I would recommend anybody to look on YouTube on Mr. Toibín wonderful lectures and interviews. Unlike Irish, we don't follow European politics so closely as you follow American politics. Tell me, how is it now at the border? I mean, do you ever go back there? Because this is the bad blood. It's really fascinating story. And you were very courageous to do that.
No, they were much more afraid of me. You know, if you have this lone figure walking through the landscape, you know. So no, I didn't feel like that really at the time. Yeah.
How is it now?
Oh, it's just great. I mean, the.
Do those hatred? Do they?
No, it would take a lot more for the hatred to go, but the steps have, been taken, which is, one of the funniest things that happened in relation to America is people in Derry, notice I'm calling it Derry, because Catholics call it Derry, other people, Protestants, call it Londonderry. And so, it's Derry for Catholics, Londonderry for Protestants. What is Bill Clinton going to do when he comes to this place? What is he going to say? And Bill Clinton stood up on a platform and said that it was marvellous to be in the city of Derry, in the county of Londonderry. And everybody thought, why do we never think it? This is a beautiful moment of pure reconciliation where you get the two sides and you just say you can have both. Now, this idea of both becomes immensely important because in the Good Friday Agreement, it says that you can be, that if your identity in Northern Ireland, that your identity can be British or Irish or both. Now that or both, 2 words, just 6 letters, is the most liberating idea that, you could be a Catholic in Northern Ireland and listen to the BBC. You could be a Catholic in Northern Ireland and feel some sort of allegiance to British systems of government, for example. You could also want your children to learn the Irish language. You could be both, but both becomes a really liberating idea. And it means, of course, that even if this is really funny, if you're a viciously bigoted farmer I'm picking a farmer in Northern Ireland who's just says Presbyterian and really doesn't like Catholics or the Southern Ireland or Europe or anywhere, and you realize your kids can't take advantage of education schemes in Europe because they're not citizens anymore because of Brexit. You can get an Irish passport without just sending your photo, filling in a form. You don't have to, no allegiance, no taxation, absolutely nothing, and we'll send you back a passport. And they're doing this in their hundreds of thousands, as people are in Britain who discover they have an Irish granny that they didn't even like. And they can get, on the basis of one grandparent, you can get an Irish passport. And that has, but with the border, the real complaint is you're driving from Belfast, and I did this twice before Christmas, and the same thing happened twice. You see how far it is to Dublin, and you think, I'm nearer than I thought. And you realise, no, you're not. It's miles in Northern Ireland. It's kilometres in Southern Ireland. I mean, in this little island. I mean, just imagine in a place of state, you've got two systems of measuring. But other than that, you come to the border and there's no sign. There's no one to stop you. There is absolutely there's no customs. There's no passport. You can bring anything you want through. And that is, I call progress. It began in 1992. Not as an Anglo-Irish agreement, but as a European thing, that the Maastricht Agreement said that you could just simply drive across borders. So suddenly you could drive from France into Spain, you could drive from Germany into, and this happened in Ireland. And it really made a difference to people, because people who were working in the north could live in the south, or vice versa. You could cross easily all the time without thinking border, no border. And so the big problem now is, and it's logical, Northern Ireland is part of Britain. Britain is not in the European Union. The only land border now Europe has with Britain is that Irish border, which is the snakiest, strangest thing with so many secret crossings, and it's a smuggler's paradise. And how are you going to close this border again? First of all, the Irish government has said, why would you, after all the years of negotiation to open it, why would you now close it? So they're now trying to get together an agreement. You can just imagine. I mean, it's trying to. How do you get an agreement as to where you would stop the truck? There's a truck. The truck is bringing smuggled goods or some sort of goods from Britain into Europe. Where do you stop it? Well, you can't stop it from Ireland going to France because that's an open border. So anyway, that's what, at the moment, these terrible politicians are involved in an effort to get a pure compromise on this matter of where the border is. You see, because if the border is down the Irish Sea, that means Ireland is a united entity. So it annoys unionists in Northern Ireland. And the effort of the whole negotiation has been to annoy no one. Could we have an agreement that annoys no one? It won't please everyone, but just annoys no one. And but this business of where this new border is to be under this new Brexit. And of course, we feel constantly that Brexit, they'll get sense eventually and they'll want to come back in. And I'm all for letting them in, but at the moment, it looks as though they're going to stick with their Brexit for a decade or two, just to annoy us. And but where do you put the border? Because we don't want a border anymore on our island. I mean, it makes no sense economically. I should say there's another thing, that if you're trading from Northern Ireland, just say you make shoes, you are now part of two open economies. You're part of Britain and you're part of Europe from Northern Ireland. So you think they would love this. But nothing is ever simple. I mean, you learn that, don't you?
You do. Oh my gosh. Let's have one more.
We have one more question in the streaming world. We have from Richard Mullaney. He asks if you have an opinion about the Banshees of Inisherin. And also, quote unquote, and then he says, and also Belfast.
Oh,
is that a movie? Okay. And
I haven't seen.
Just before you answer, Catherine says, "Thank you, this was fabulous," and somebody else says, "Wonderful talk."
I haven't seen the Banshees.
Stop. He doesn't have.
But I saw Belfast, and there's something interesting about Belfast, which is I thought it was the first film that didn't glorify or make exciting the bombings. That it made them frightening. It made them these wonderful family were going to have to move. That we've seen so many films using Belfast as a sort of mafia place, or as a place where the next moment is shooting and all sorts of figures with balaclavas. This one was an effort to show actually didn't feel like that if you lived there. Yeah. But I mean I'll deal with the Banshees in time.
I just want to thank you so much. This was wonderful. I've looked forward to talking to you forever.
Thank you very much.
If we can just say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colm and Susan. I watched Banshees twice, so I can fill you in, Colm, if you need.
Have all your fingers.
Yeah. So if you haven't gotten the book already, it's in the museum store. We have also plenty of other books and other goodies there. And for those of you online, you can get the book through our museum store online. And that's it for tonight. Have a great evening. Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you.